we're familiar with the reason that the Mishnah Berurah brings to explain the Ramah, where the Ramah says, "Noyagim bekama makoymos le'echol ma'chali cholov," that there's a minhag in a number of places to eat milk-based foods on Yom Tov of Shavuos. So the Berurah brings, we heard B'Shem Gadol Echad. This Lashon of Mishnah Berurah is not copied on the Maram HaKoyim, so I'll just read out the Lashon of Mishnah Berurah, that he heard B'Shem Gadol Echad, that Ki be'eis she'omdu al har Sinai v'kiblu ha'Torah, when Klal Yisrael makabel Torah, v'yardu min ha'har lebeisam, and then they went away from the har back home, lo motzu ma lechol techef, they didn't find what to eat. Ki im ma'chali cholov, the only thing that they could eat were ma'chali cholov. Ki lebasar tzarech hachana rabba. For basar, they needed a lot of preparation. It needed shchita, it needed to remove the chalev and the dam, it needed hadacha and melicha, they needed to cook in new kalim because the previous kalim were balua with iser, and therefore they chose to eat ma'chali cholov. Now, there are a number of ha'aras on this Mishnah Berurah. It's a very difficult Mishnah Berurah for a number of reasons. But the aspect that we'll try and focus on is that the Mishnah Berurah is assuming that all the various parshas of the Torah, for example, the chiyuv of shchita, the isser of chalev and dam, and all the possible isurim that would have been balua in the kalim, all immediately applied after Matan Torah. And we'll see that this is a machlokes in the Kadmonim as to whether or not all the parshas HaTorah apply to Klal Yisrael immediately after Matan Torah. There's a familiar Rashi. Rashi brings it from the Sifri, but the Drosha is also a Gemara in Masechta Yuma on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis. It's on the Maram HaKoyim sheet on page 1. In the middle of the page, there's a copy of the Gemara in Yuma. In the parsha of the Asafsuf Asher B'Kirboy is Avu Tava in Parshas Ba'aloischa. So there the Gemara says, the Psukim say it's Zacharnu es Hadoga Asher Noicha b'Mitzrayim Chinam. So the Gemara has a drosha. Zacharnu es Hadoga Asher Noicha b'Mitzrayim Chinam. Rabbi Shmuel, Machlok is Rabbi Shmuel. Chad Omar Dogim. One says it literally means dogim. The Chad Omar Aroyas. That there were Aroyas that were mutter in Mitzrayim that are now aser. So the Gemara says, if we continue down, the Gemara says, Elo lemanda Omar Arayas mai mayan chosum. What does it mean that Klal Yisrael and Mitzrayim were godru from Arayas? So the Gemara says, Mehanoch de asiron loy peritze behu. From those that were osa lebnei noyach, those Klal Yisrael kept meticulously. So the Gemara says, Bishloim alamand Omar Arayas hainu l'chsiva yishma Moshe sa'om boicha l'mishbechoisav al iske mishbechoisav shenesru lohem lishkav etzlam el lamand Omar dogimai boicha l'mishbechoisav. And the Gemara says, hava ha havoi. It was both. So if we look at Rashi, just copied to the right of this Gemara, Rashi the middle of the column, Rashi says loy hoyu prutzim barayas b'mitzrayim. Zot Rashi hanach da asiron oisam shoyu nesaras libnei noyach. Kigon hanach da minum b'sanhedrin erev shebezin sheisrom amisam alei ben noyach muzar alei vehein bochu al hanoi safos. So to summarize, what we see from the Gemara is this: that the Maskonas HaGemara, both according to Rav and Shmuel, part of the Asafsuf Asher B'Kirbo his Avu Tava was because they were boiche for the arayas that became oser when Klal Yisrael changed from Bnei Noach to Bnei Yisrael. The arayas that are oser to Bnei Noach, Klal Yisrael were godur in Mitzrayim. Boiche le'mishbechoisav, zot the Gemara al iske mishbechoisav shenesru lehem lishkav etzlam. In Rashi's Lashon is vehin bochu al hanoisafis. Rashi brings this drosh in Chumash b'shem the Sifri on the words boiche le'mishbechoisav. Rashi says boichem Rabbi Seinu Amr le'mishbechoisav al ishke mishbechoisav al arayas hanesaras lahem. Director Be'eli Mizrahi, why were they only being boiche now, after almost a year from Matan Torah? Hare, when was it that Asafsa Asher Bekirbo his Avu Taiva Leimar Mi Achilenu Basar? That was after the Nesaya HaMachnois, which is in the Shana Hashenis, after the Esrim L'Chodesh Hasheni. We spoke in a previous limud. The Esrim L'Chodesh Hasheni was Shiva Yomim after Pesach Sheni. Then there were Nesaya. Then came Asafsa Asher Bekirbo his Avu Taiva. That was 11 months after Matan Torah, which was Vovo Zayin Sivan of the Shana Rishayna, let's say something Mitzrayim. The Noisophois, the Isri Surya Rayas happened immediately b'shas Matan Torah affected Beli Mizrachi. So why were they boicha only almost a year later? So Mikoach this kasher, Beli Mizrachi proves that Al Korchoch, the parasha of Arayas, wasn't nimsar to them until much later. And he has a raya. He says it's a Gemara Mufureshes that not all the parashas were given b'shas Matan Torah. The Gemara is a familiar Gemara. The Gemara on Daf Samach in Gittin. On the Yom of Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the Shana Hashenis, the Yom Shehukam HaMishkan, Boi Bayom Nemu Shmoina Parashiyos, also appears in the Sugya of Matan Torah in Shabbos. Boi Bayom, as the Shmoina Parashiyos were Nemar, and the Rishonim explain why those Parashiyos were Nemar Ba'isa Yom. Those Parashiyos weren't Nemar b'Shas Matan Torah and were Nemar Kefi HaTzoyrech. Memela Zot Erel Mizrachi. We see a yesod from that Gemara in Gittin, that even though we know that all Torah was Nitan the Moshe b'Sinai, but it was only Nishna to Klal Yisrael at certain times. So Mele Zot Rebeli Mizrachi, who had in the Gabi the Parasha of Arayas. In the Lashon of Rebeli Mizrachi, he says, Im Kain Afal Pi Shekvar Nemru LeMoshe b'Sinai, those Shmoina Parashiyos, Loi Omron li Yisrael ad Rosh Chodesh Nisan Shabahukam HaMishkan, V'Shemo Gam b'Parashas HaRayas Loi Nemru li Yisrael ad Samach L'Nesiyosam Me'ar Sinai. So from Rebeli Mizrachi, we see this yesod that even though Kol HaTorah Kula was Nimsa LaMoshe, not necessarily every parasha was Nitan right away. And Memela, there were only Boicha LaMishpachei Sehem when the parasha was Nimsar, which we see was only Samach L'Nesiyosam Me'ar Sinai. Now, Kama v'Kama Kadmoinim, Mefarshei Rashi, argue on this Rebeli Mizrachi, and they give various reasons why, even though the parasha of Harayas was already Nimsar, b'Shas Matan Torah, Klal Yisrael was only Boicha LaMishpachei Sehem later on. We'll be ma'ayin in one of those Mahalchim and Achreinim, a very sadistic Mahalch of the Achreinim, as we'll see, and from that we'll open a very basic Machlekes HaRishayim in the Dinim of Matan Torah. This beer comes from the Sefer Maskil David. The Maskil David is David Pardai, the Baal Chazdei David, on the Toseftos. He says like this: Afal gav de mikame hochi osa lehem arayas. Avad, it's not like Rebeli Mizrachi. There were osa barayas the whole time. Nira de ad shaloi hukam hamishkan hoyu mitztarim al maise ha'egel shadayin lo niskaper lehem legamri. We know from Rashi and Parsha Shmini that the full kapara was only confirmed to Klal Yisrael when Shechina was yared on the oil mayed. So Memele zok the Maskil David lahu noislim libam lisa noshim. Now it's not just a chiddush of the Maskil David that because they were mitzvah Memele they were noisa noshim. This is a din. The pasuk in Parshas Kisisa is that when the Klal Yisrael heard from Moshe Rabbeinu the chaymer of the Chet HaEgel, it says vayisabolu, it's midin avelus, and ovel is the ha'asal lisa isha. Is Memela that Avelus was goyim that they weren't noisa noshim. So Memela is not the Maskil David after Hukam HaMishkan. They weren't noisa noshim right away because how you trudim b'karbonei seim. They were tarred in Shmenis Miluim u'b'mitzvahs HaPesach. V'acha shenosu michoyre v'yodedaitu lisa noshim osbochu asher nesel ha'makrovis. So Reb David Pardai, the Maskil David, says a teretz nifla. He says Avada the chiddush of Rebeli Mizrachi I'm not masking to. Parashas Harayas was nimsat to them right away. Why weren't they boichel l'mishpachei seim? Because it wasn't negeh. They weren't going to be nois and noshim until they were neseim mehar chayrev. That's the yesod of the Maskil David. The Maskil David, if we're ma'ayin, is an absolute pella from Riyata. Mamash a pella. Hare. If we're going to assume like the Maskil David, not like the Mizrachi, that Parashas Harayas was nimsa to Klal Yisrael right after Matan Torah. What steht in the Gemara in Yuma? The Gemara in Yuma says that even though Klal Yisrael Mitzrayim were godur in Harayas, but that was only the Harayas that were asurim libnei Noach, not the Harayas that were nitoiseh. So now, that means in Klal Yisrael, Keseda, people were marrying in Mitzrayim noshim that were arayas liyisrael, but not arayas lebnei Noach. What's the best example of this? Amram shenosa daidosai, sugi and saita. Amram married an erva to Yisrael, but not an erva lebnei Noach. According to the masculine David, it would come out that if Parshas Arayas was Nimsat Yisrael right after Matan Torah, then the rega of Matan Torah, Klal Yisrael had to be megarish those noshim that were Arayas. So what did the masculine David help with his teretz? And he says, the way I can argue on Rebel Mizrachi and say that the oila on the Pasha was given right after Matan Torah. No, the reason why it was Beichel and HaMishbachos only later was because Klal Yisrael weren't being nice and noshim for various reasons. But they had to be megarish Shem right away. This is the pliya on the, this is the pella on the masculine David. So to perhaps have a mahalach, to assume like the masculine David that the parasha of Arayas is nimsa right away, but on the other hand, to try and explain how it was that Klal Yisrael did not have to megarish l'sheiseim b'shas Matan Torah. So we'll begin with a very basic shaila b'negea to a din that's muskar and b'negea to kama SUGYAS in Shas, and that is the din of gershin is gayer kekoten shenoi ladom. Sugya nivamis, that if a shaklevataria b'negea to if there's any chayis between someone who's nisgayer and benoi, between a ger and oviv, b'negea to Yerusha, b'negea to dinim of pira v'rivya. In kama v'kam, b'negea to kama v'kam dinim, the Gemara establishes that gershin nisgayer is kekoten shenoi ladom. Now, there's a Chasam Sofer in Chidushim, in Masechta Avodah Zarah, in the Samach Gimel Amud Beis, and the Chasam Sofer is copied on the top right of page 1 of the Maramakamis. Chasam Sofer says, V'Rambam b'Dmai Pirush. The Rambam in Masechta Dmai explains that the reason why a Gershin is Gayer is Kekoten Shenoi Ladomi is because Shehadas Hifrid. The das, the fact that one is Yisrael and one is an Akum, is mafrid beineim. There can't be chayis, there can't be kurva between two people who one is Yisrael and one's an Akum. It's not possible. That's why a ger doesn't have a yichus im oviv. Now, just to explain, the Gemara is mafurish that even if the av was nisgayer and the ben was nisgayer, there's still no chayis between them. Even though at this point the das isn't mafrid beineim. The answer is because one became a ger at a different time than the other became a ger. There isn't, even if it would be possible that they both became a ger b'vasachas, it's two separate ma'aseh geros. So memela la'olam zot the Rambam, we have this metzius of das mafrid beineim. As an aside, it's kedai to perhaps suggest that this Rambam, that the reason why gershin is ger kodesh shenoi is because of das mafrid beineim, may be a hezber for a yisoid, which we'll come back to, and that is that the Shev Shmaitza in the Hagdama, the Sefer brings from the Maral in Gur Ari and Parshas Vayigash, that Matan Torah didn't have the din of Gershin is Garak Kotten Shalei Ladam. Hagam that Klal Yisrael b'Shas Matan Torah were Gerim, and the Gemara in Yivamas and Dafim Vav is mufurish that all say the Geris we learn from Matan Torah, Mila Tvila and Hartzoas Domim, that Geirus requires L'Deiris is all learned from the Mila in Mitzrayim and that so as Dom of the Karbonis B'Shas Matan Torah is all learned from the Seder of Matan Torah, but the Maral's Mechadish that Matan Torah didn't have the din, the Geirus did not have a din of Gershin is Garak Kodesh Shenei Ladomi. If you look on the second page of the Maramakamis, on the right hand side, the very last paragraph says Hemshech Divrei Shev Shmaitza. So on the third line, he says, Hine b'sefer Gur Aryeh, the Shev Shmaitza quotes a Maral in Parshas Vayigash. Maral asks a kasha. He says, Kevon di Yisrael b'matan Torah din geirim hoyalahem kedi isa b'yavamis, di Yisrael hoyu tzrichim mila v'hazol tvila kedin geirim, v'kaim alon the halacha that is that midoraisa ger noisa achoisa, a ger can marry his sister. Mishum the gershin is gai kotten shenoi ladomi, im kein la oisa hadoy hoyo roy lahatir kroy v'is erva. So all those who were b'shas matan Torah already born, had no kurva, so the entire door were rechokim zemizeh. The Tiritz, the Maral says, "Dolo yamrin on gershin is gar ke cotton shnoy adomi ela begershin is gar mi daitoi v'cheftzoy ozu ke cotton shnoy lad. Aber b'shas matan Torah shu huchruchu lekabala shekof aleim har ke gigis bezelo have ke cotton shnoy lad." The chiddush nifla of the Maral that a ger that's muchrach, a gerus that's muchrach doesn't have the din of gershin is gar ke cotton shnoy adomi. Now the yisoid is a difficult yisoid. What's the nafkamina between whether or not the gerus is berotzen or the gerus is bekfir? There's an HaRav in the Sefer Klichemda from Meir Don Palotsky in Parshas Yisroi, where Meir Don is married to explain the Sisoid of the Maral. But Lule, the what? Yeah, but the Sisoid.
All the sheets are going that the Gerus, the Paisel became eaten by Mount Torah, but there's some Rishonim that say, like Ramban and Hashem, there's one. Some say the Gerus that they had been in Israel before. So actually,
he says when he's talking about the Ramban and Parshas Emor that says the Avos HaKadoshim had the din of Yisrael Kedem L'chein, and there was some chefts of Hashem Yisrael before. Yeah, I understand, but that right. There are mufurish rishonim that there was some Shem of Yisrael before, and there was even a chefts of Gerus. But Avada, that's mufurish Gemara that Matan Torah was a seder of Gerus. So Al Karchach and the Achreinim Machalik between what Shem Yisrael there was kind before and what the Shem of Yisrael was Nigmar the Gerus of Matan Torah. But Homias, the seder of Gerus was the seder of Matan Torah was the seder of Gerus the Kuliyam. That's a Gemara mufurashes. So the Lule the Maral, according to the Rambam, we have a different reason why possibly there was no din of Gershin is Gar Kotten Shana Adam b'Shas Matan Torah. Because the Rambam explains the din of Gershin is Gar Kotten Shana Adam is because the das is mafrid beineim. So we ask that the das mafrid beineim, how does that apply to where both the Av and the Ben are Gerim? The answer is it's two separate Ma'aseh Gerus. In the case of the Gerus of Klal Yisrael b'Shas Matan Torah, the Gerus was b'Vasachas. So there's no concept of hadas mafrid beineim. So Lefi the Rambam and Pirsha Mishnayos and Demai, we have another reason why the Gerus of Matan Torah didn't have the din of Gershin is Gaik Kotten Shnei L'Adami Al Derech of the Maral, but Shaloi Mitame. That's an aside. So Zot the Chasam Sofer, he says, if we go back now to the top right of page 1, he says, Yogati harbe v'loi motzosi minole l'rabonon ho de kekotten shanoilat umuter ba'achoisa yubitoi v'imoi. The Chasam Sofer says, where's the makar that Chazal knew the din of Gershin is Gaik Kotten Shanoilat? There's no Gemara that brings a makar for this halach. Now, we do find Ze'er Poi, Ze'er Shom in Rishonim, that the Rishonim don't give us a makar, but they give us a smach. Just to mention one example in Inyana D'Yoma, it's not copied on the Maramakoyim sheets, but to mention an example in Inyana D'Yoma. There's a Ritva in Yevomis on Daf Mem Chesem Beis, in the end of the Sugi of Gerus, where the Ritva B'toich Dvarov says that the pasuk in Megillas Rus, Yishalom Hashem Poloch v'timaskutich shleima v'yim Hashem Elokei Yisrael asher bos lachzis tachas knofov. So the Ritva says that the words asher bos means k'moi noldo michadash. Asher bos, you became a new being tachas knofov. Zot the Ritva, that's a smach to the din of Gershin is Gaik Kotten Shnei L'Adami. Another Maramakom is you'll see on page 2 of the Maramakom is top right. Rabbi Socher Dov Goldstein, the Rav of Rosh Koel of Shem Rachamis and the Rav of Chasam Sofer in Yerushalayim, published in Moiriya, the Kovetz of Machon Yerushalayim. He published in Moiriya a mitzvah that he found in the Chidushim of the Ravan in Masechta Yevomis, where the Ravan in Yevomis and Chav Beis Amud Aleph says that the smach is from the pasuk by the Avos, by Avraham and Sarah, and the nefashos asher osu b'choram. Nefashos asher osu means nefashos that they made. They lived before. Zot the Ravan, from here there's a smach that Gershin is Gaik Kotten Shnei L'Adami. Huh? Well, first you mentioned the Ramban that there was a Gerus, right? That was the Ramban you mentioned before in Parshas Emor, right? And Avada, the Briskirov proves in Yuma stencil that Avada there was a Metzias of Gerus. It's a Gemara. The Gemara in Saita says, how was Yehuda Boil Tamar Gira? So Avada Zot the Briskirov, there was some musig of Gerus before Matan Torah. So Zot the Briskirov, Zot the Ravan, That level of Geirus, even though it wasn't a Geirus Gemur, like what we pointed out from before, from the Gemara Nivamas, but it had the din of Gershin Gak Gotten Shnei Ladami. So Bisocher Dave Goldstein was mafarsin this Ravan that there's a smach from the Foshas HaOisais that there's a din of Gershin Gak Gotten Shnei Ladami. Another Maramakim that's kedai to mention, a Chumash Maramakim, the Balaturim in Parshas Kiseitze, on the posuk of Loisatem Mishpat Ger V'Yosim. So it doesn't say Ger V'Yosim, it says Loisatem Mishpat Ger Yosim. Zok the Balaturim, why doesn't it say Ger V'Yosim? Because every Ger is a Yosim. Because Gershin is Ger, now, Avada Rabbi say it's important to be madgish that all of these are not Makoros. None of these are mentioned Mefurish in Chazal or in Shas. The Rishonim are saying that these are all a smach. But minolu lechazal the etzem hadin. How do we know it? How do we know it? So to answer this shaila of the Chasam Sofer, Remei Simcha in Meshech Chochma, the din of Gershin is Gak Kotten Shnei Ladami. Ma'ayin lehu. How do they know it? No makar, not that we know of. There is no makar in Chazal that brings a drosha for Kotten Shnei Ladami. So Zok Remei Simcha, Lule that the Chasam Sofer says, and he quotes the Chasam Sofer. It's printed just below the Chasam Sofer, right hand side. Page 1 of the Maramakim says, Lule the Chasam Sofer says that Niskasha Kol Yomov. He says, Ludaiti Poshut. It's a pasuk mafurish in the Torah. What's the pasuk? Zok the Meshech Chochma. The mistama hoya liyotzim mitzrayim noshim harbe shoyim oisim she'im v'ninach musharim aleim. Like we said from the Gemara in Yuma, there were nois and noshim that were arayas liyisrael, but not arayas lebnei noach. Zok the Meshech Chochma v'amram yochiach shegodol hador hoya v'nosa deidosai. V'im loy harugiyim loy hayuboichim. Zok Remei Simcha in the middle of the paragraph. Ve'eich omer achmona achar matan Torah shuvu lochem lo aleichem. Ve'ein oloi eloi ishtoi. The Gemara in Be'o says, haloi elu shenosu krobei sim tzichem lifreish mehem. Va'al korchov the Gershin is gar ki kotten shnei ladomi. Zok Remei Simcha beposh the cheshbon. Gershin is gar ki kotten shnei ladomi. Yeah.
Anyone who's going to Mitzrayim is children and his children. So that whole part of Nachos.
What do you mean? So if it was the Yotzim Mitzrayim Nischalka, then the Chayra there was never Murdik. This kasha I found in the Chalifas Mechtavim between the Rabbi Yisachar Dov Goldstein and Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern, the Moitzi La'or of the Ksavim of the Chasam Sofer. In one of the Chalokim of Miriah, they have a Masumat, and this is one of the kashas that they ask. If we have time, B'siyata D'Shmaya, we'll try and get to it. It's printed on the second page of the Maramakim. It's a Kushya Atzuma. It's nichval in the kasha really of the Maral that for that whole door there was no musik of Kroven. But this it's a kushya nifla that you're asking. But and if in the time we have left, we'll try to take it step by step. So Zod Remei Simcha, the din of Gershin is gar kikotin shnei ladomi took care of all our eyes in Mitzrayim. Mimele Zod Remei Simcha shuva lochem lo aleichem was a bezundere matir on them being nice and the on them remaining with the Shesayim. So l'chor we now have a Pesach to understand the Hanoch of the Maskil David. That even though Avada, the Parsha Barais, may have been Nema right away, the reason why they didn't have to be Perishim in Shesayim is because of Gershin is Garki Kotten Shnei Ladami. Frektzach the Shaila, that if that's true, and they had Gershin is Garki Kotten Shnei Ladami, so then a year later, what would they be in Bleichel and Mishpachesayim? Let's say we even accept the Maskil David that for a year they weren't Nois and Noshim because they were Avelus until Hakomas HaMishkan, and afterwards they were Torah and Karbanas. Now they wanted to be Nois each other. What was the problem? Elamai was speaking about those that were Noilad for them in the last 11 months. They're not B'nois B'yah, they're Pochas Mibas Gimel. So even though we now have an Eitzah for the Maskil David, why they didn't have to be Persian and Shesem right away, but then we don't understand how later they were Ba'ichal and Mishpachaysa. What was the problem? So, Loi Meboya, if we don't accept the Hanocha of the rebellion Mizrachi that Pasha Rayas wasn't Imsavalem, we can't be Monoshach be Mefarnes Chazal. Hare B'Shas Matan Torah they weren't Ba'ichal and Mishpachaysa, and only a year later they weren't. If you're going to say Kikotan Shnei Ladomi, then we lose what the problem with the Shana is. If you're going to say Pasha Rayas was Nimsalahem, then they should have been Ba'ichal right away. So, Mimonoshach. Elamai, the only eight says the rebellion is Rochi, that the parasha wasn't Ne'emar Tem, it was only Ne'emar later. It's a Chiddush Gadol. So the other Nakuda to point out, which I think is what you were pointing out before, is that Rameh Simcha is also arguing on the Maral. The Maral says there was no Gershon as Gakov and Shalom Adom Matan Torah, because otherwise they should be mutter be'erva throughout the midbar. And in Rameh Simcha state that the Avada there was. So possibly to suggest the Mahalach. If we look carefully and back in that Mishnah, should we summarize the Shilas? We have a Gemara in Yuma which actually quotes B'Shem the Sifri that in the Shana Shenis, after the Nesiah from Har Sinai, after Chof Iyar, there was a sugya of Boichel Mishbachaisav, which is a free, and the Gemara in Yuma means for the Araya Shani Toisfu Lahem. Rashi in Masechta Yuma was mavur that in Mitzrayim there were nois and noshim that were asuros as arayas, the arayas the Yisrael, but they were not nois; they were gedurim and arayas lebnei noach. Zokt Rameh Simcha. Why did they not have to be perished on those noshim immediately after Matan Torah? Because it was a heter of shuva lechem lo aleichem, which was based on the din of Gershon Izgar Kikotten Shnei Ladam. Frektach the Shaila. If that's the answer why they weren't perished, so what were they boicha about a year later? HaRav there were no arayas, and that's a loshon of the Maral that the Shmaitzer quotes from the Gur Aryeh, that all those are borim shana. Essentially, they should have been mutter b'arayas. Kol adorahu should have been mutter b'krevei sehem. Elomai, there wasn't a din of Gershon Izgar Kikotten Shnei Ladam b'shas Matan Torah like the Maral. So Hadra Kushel Duchta that they should have been perished right away. The only eitzah we have is to say like the masculine David that they weren't nice and noshim. So if they weren't nice and noshim, weiter they should have been perished right away. Elamai, we're going to say that there was a din of Gershon Izgar Kikotten Shnei Ladami, so then they shouldn't have been boichel mishpachaisav later. If there was no din of Gershon Izgar Kikotten Shnei Ladami like the Maral, then they should have to be perished. They should say him right away. That's the mamashach. So, Kanire, what is mavur is that be'etzem, like Rameh Simcha, that there was a bezundere heter of shuva lechem lo aleichem, but that wasn't mitzad the din of Gershon Izgar Kikotten Shnei Ladami. It was a specific heter to be shavlin and sheseim. What's the beer in that? So, if we're medayik in the lashon of the Mishnah Berurah carefully that we quoted before, b'shem the Gadol Echad, that immediately when they came down from Har Sinai, all the dinim of machalas asuris applied. So if we medayik carefully in the lashon of Mishnah Berurah, I apologize, it's not quoted on the Marmakayim, so I'll read it out. It's a short lashon. It says like this: Ki baseres hadibris nisgal lehem al yidei zeh kol chelkei ha'Torah. Be'emes, the parasha wasn't taught to Klal Yisrael right then. Just through hearing that Seres Hadibros, they knew all the parashas HaTorah. Why? Moshe Kosav Reb Sadi Goin, the Ramban Rishonim bringing the name of Reb Sadi Goin, Sheba Seres Hadibros Klu V'Kol HaTorah. When they heard Seres Hadibros, they understood mitoich that all the dinim. And Rabbeinu Sadi Goin in the Ramban in Josh's Teres Hashem T'mima, the Ramban is marich to explain how all the Torah mitzvahs are nirmaz in that Seres Hadibros. So Zod Chafetz Chaim, the way they knew that it required shchita, the way they knew there was an Isser of Chelev and Dam, the way they knew that there was an Isser of what's Balua and the Kalim, all came from what they understood, mitoich, what's nirmaz and Aseres Hadibros. As they state in the parentheses in the Mishnah Berurah. Now, Yesh Lachka. That they understood, mitoich the Aseres Hadibros, all the Dini HaTorah, is that bedin mitzuva v'oiseh or bedin eini mitzuva v'oiseh? I mean, the parasha wasn't given to Klal Yisrael. They understood mitoich la'aseres hadibros all the Torah mitzvahs. What din did that have? They had the din of mitzvah va'isa, or now they understood mitoich matan Torah. Avada, of course. But we know from Chazal that Nitan Moshe Misinai, and the Ramban says at the end of Parashat B'chugosai, spans from matan Torah until the Krisas Bris Ba'el Moed. That's what Har Sinai means. It doesn't mean literally b'shas matan Torah. And we see that from Beli Mizrachi also. Shmoina parashas nimser ba'isa yom, he shows from the Gemara in Gittin, means there was some parashas that were nimser l'basoif. And the Ramban says, Mefurish in the Akdama to Sefer Dvarim, that mitzvahs that weren't going to be knowing until they came la'aretz, were only nimser kodim k'nisas on la'aretz. And we understand that not all Torah go nimser ba'isa zman. So l'chor we could say that since it wasn't nimsa to them as a parasha, it's only what they understood. It had a din of eine mitzvah v'oisa. As I want me to can sagen. Now, eine mitzvah v'oisa, and that what Klal Yisrael understood that those things were aser, doesn't mean necessarily that it's their choice to do it or not do it. For example, the Rishonim, the Ramban, primarily on Niskasha, that if the Mishnah in the end of Kiddushin says that Avraham Avinu was Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kula Achlei Nitna, so how do we find that the others were Noisei Noshem Asuras? Yaakov Shanosa Shtei Achis, etc. So there's a teretz of the Ramban that there's a difference in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, which will explain the Arayas of Mitzrayim. But there's another Yisoid that the Nefesh HaChaim is Mavur. The Nefesh HaChaim says, Einochanam. Avada knowing the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom meant that they were awesome. But there was a cheshbon that if they understood that there would be some ruchnistic tayeles, some ruchnistic accomplishment by being nice and Hashem Asuras, which in the Lashon Nefesh HaChaim is called a tikkun. Then Avada, they did it. They did it. Yaakov was nice shtei achiyos because, like it says in Megillas Rus, Rochel v'Leah asher bonu shteim is beis Yisrael, Rochel and Leah the amudim of Klal Yisrael. So Mila, they were nice shtei achiyos, which means the klal that Nefesh HaChaim is saying is that Avada, knowing the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom, is Mechayev. Just the difference between whether it's B'Torah Tzivui or whether it's just knowing the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom means, can I make a cheshbon? Are we allowed to make a cheshbon that there will be, so to speak, a greater tikkun by not keeping the din than by keeping it? If it's a tzivui, in eitza ve'in chochma ve'in tvuna l'neged Hashem. Once Torah is nitan and it's stabbed to Klal Yisrael, mishas matan Torah and not zot the Nefesh HaChaim, we cannot make any cheshbonos in terms of would there be a possibility to contravene the Torah because of a greater tikkun. Eina mitzvah ba'isa, you can make a cheshbon. And zot the Nefesh HaChaim, that's what. So he says, today, even luya hey, we could know the cheshbonos. We can no longer do that because that gufo is part of what. God laver lishma is a good cheshbon, which time doesn't matter. The God laver lishma, the Nefesh HaChaim, the Chaim Eloshen himself in the Sefer Keser Rosh has a piece where he bavarns God laver lishma. Chaim Eloshen is a shayla. But the story that Chaim Eloshen explains like this: once Torah was nitan, he says, then ein eitzav ein tfuna l'neged Hashem. And not just that, he says any cheshbon, even if we could understand it, would by definition be wrong, because the Torah was kaveh that once the parashas HaTorah, when it's stave, all tikkunim and all teyelas ruchnis comes through parashas HaTorah. No other way. But koydem, even if we're aware of the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom, since it's not b'Torah tzivui, we can make a cheshbon that there be a tikkun through this and this way. Well, yeah, correct. But that's that's one possible teretz. If Nevuah could even create avera lishma la'achashin in the Torah, but that's a shayla, and it's not clear that it was b'teres nevuos. But that's the kasha is the kasha, and Chaim Eloshen has two roots into that in Keser Rosh. Fine. Now the following. The Chafetz Chaim says that when Klal Yisrael was Yered Mehar Sinai, after they heard the Aseres HaDibros, they knew mitzad what's included in the Aseres HaDibros all Taryag. But we're suggesting that that's b'Toras Eina Mitzvah Va'isa. What's the difference of Reb Chaim Eloshen between Eina Mitzvah Va'isa and Mitzvah Va'isa? Means can we make a cheshbon that there's some tikkun that would allow us to remain? Perhaps we could say the following. Klal Yisrael knew the parasha of all Yisurim Shabbat, the parashas of all Yisurim Shabbat Torah, as the Mishnah Berurah explains. They knew it mitoich, like the Goinim say mitoich remozim of the Aseres HaDibros. But that's mechayev, unless we have a cheshbon and it's rocks and shamayim otherwise. So memela b'negeh to ma'acholas asura zot the Mishnah Berurah avad the Klal Yisrael had to keep it. By arayas, Klal Yisrael had a tzivui from the Rebbeinu Shalom shuvu lechem lo aleichem. Dahainu, because the parasha wasn't yet nitztava as a parasha of Arayas, what was only begeder eina mitzvah v'oisa, so memela there's possible to have a specific zersakos of an heter that says there's a heter l'shah to remain with Arayas. Avada, besides for those Arayas that were there b'shaitoi, of course they couldn't be noisei other noshim, because Even if the Parsha of Arayas, like the Rebelli Mizrahi says, was only Nimsa later, but the Parsha was Mechayiv, unless we know that there's some tikkun. Shuva lochem lalechem. There's a bezunder matter lefisho. So Memela, we can make the cheshbon the following. Avada, we can assume, even like the Maral, the Gershon is Gair is not gekoten Shanel Adomi. So then they had to be Megashish and say him right away. The answer is as a bezunder matter of Shuva lochem lalechem. But that matter is only possible kol zman that the Parsha is not given. That's a bezunder heter. That's min hashomayim. There's a heter on the Parsha. Once the Parsha is already given, then Avada the din of Arayas. Then Avada applies. So Memela later, when they came to be Nois and Noshim, Zot Rebelli Mizrahi, in that case, Avada the Parsha of Arayas was B'tokfoy. The what? They didn't have to. They had a heter of Shuva L'chem L'Aleichem. That's not Ramei Simcha. But we can only have the heter of Shuva L'chem L'Aleichem if the Parsha wasn't yet given as a full Parsha of Arayas. If the Parsha was Nimsa as a Parsha of Arayas, then we have no heter B'chlal. Masha Enkin, if the Parsha was only Nitan as a Mechayiv of the Tzivui, so then in the Chanami, it's Shaykh Shuva L'chem L'Aleichem, because Mipi Elyon, the Rebbeinu Shem was Mitzvah, then in this case, it should remain B'neshei Seim. That was part of the Simcha of after Matan Torah, Shuva L'chem L'Aleichem. That's perhaps what we could be Matzia to be Miyashiv, because otherwise, just to repeat the Shaila, we have a Monoshach. If the answer is like Ramei Simcha, Kotten Shanei Ladomi, then there should be no Beichel and Mishpachaisal. If the answer is that there wasn't Kotten Shanei Ladomi, then there should have had to be Megashish Seim right away. Whether or not Elomai, the Parsha was only Nimsa later, like Rebelli Mizrahi says, that Kama B'Kama Kadmoina Machela can say that about the Parsha of Arayas was Nimsa right away. What would be mispasher in the various Mahalchim is Alpidus Mishnah Bura, that B'Shas Matan Torah Klal Yisrael knew Torah as Eina Mitzvah V'Oiseh. Eina Mitzvah V'Oiseh can have a specific heter outside the Geder Hadin, and that was the heter of Shuva L'chem L'Alech. So let me just I'm so sorry. Just in the short time we have left, just to finish one nekuda. So just to add a dover nifla, that this etzem yesoi that Klal Yisrael knew Torah b'Torah's Eina Mitzvah V'Oiseh, I found Be'ez Hashem Mefurish in the Alshech. We're familiar in the Haggadah with a very difficult piska. In the piska Kamamalas Tevis L'Makam Aleinu, we say Ilu Kirvana L'Fnei HaSinai V'Leinosan Lanu Saper Dayim. So the Rishonim ask, what would have been the Teyalas in coming to Hasinai and not receive Torah? For what? So the Rishonim say that there were certain madrigas that Klal Yisrael got just from coming Keneged Dahar. One mahalach in the Rishonim is Ki'ish Echad B'Lei Vechad. Another mahalach in the Rishonim is Paska Zu Amosam B'chulei. The Alshech in Shmois, beginning of Perek Yutes, the Alshech is Niskash, and the Alshech says, let's say any of the greatest benefits and the greatest madrigas that Klal Yisrael could have achieved b'Shas Matan Torah, but to Torah allein kommt das nicht. So how can we say ilu kirvana v'lei nosan lanu Torah? Is there anything that could only be a substitute to Torah? So Zot the Alshech, it doesn't mean kirvana l'fnei Hasinai we wouldn't know Torah. He says a davar nifla. He says it would have been Paska Zu Amosam, and the belt it would be Paska Zu Amosam. They were masig b'sherish nishmasam kol Torah kula like the avos. And he says because hare what be'etzem the neshama of a ben Adam Yisrael should be masig Torah be'etzem. What there? Guf. Paska Zu Amosam, and the neshama was masik Torah be'etzem. The same teretz. What? Oh, so let's see. So he says be'etzem they would have known kol Torah kula just from kirvan l'fnei Hasinai. The etzem Yisod Advarim is brought in a number of svarim. The teretz is brought b'shem of Levi Yitzchak Aditcheva. The same teretz. That was ilu kirvana that there be masik Torah b'shorish nishmasam. The same teretz is brought in the Haggadah's Go'inei Vilna b'shem the Sefer told us Adam. So from alle kreise we have the same mahalach in Matan Torah. Zok the Alshech. So oibazoi, if Klal Yisrael were anyway masik kol Torah kul b'sherish nishmasam, so what do we need the kolos ubrakim of Matan Torah? Zok the Alshech kedei that Klal Yisrael should be mitzvah v'oiseh. Zay zok that. Kum dechoy steht in Alshech mefurish. That be'etzem mitzad yidias kol Torah kula they knew it. The difference that Matan Torah accomplished in mitzvah v'oiseh. So heimei madvarim. Parashi is that when Nishna Lahedya transformed Klal Yisrael from being Eina mitzvah v'oisem to mitzvah v'oisem. So heimei madvarim. Avad Klal Yisrael be yediyah we'eina mitzvah v'oisem. To be over out Eina mitzvah v'oisem, befrat to be over on the darg of the others, that depends on whether or not Klal Yisrael understood that there will be tikkunim b'davar. The tzivui of Shuva L'chan L'Aleichem was a tzivui milamalo v'hagam, that now Klal Yisrael understood the chomer of Arayas of Yisrael, but Kozman it was Eina mitzvah v'oisem, it was a shaykh matir. Mikanu lahabo, Avada the din was choizer. Now, it's possible to say that this is not a stira to Ramei Simcha. And avada that there was a din of Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi. What would be the beer? And well, this Beis Hashem will finish. What Ramei Simcha possibly is saying is like this. We're being matzia, laniyos da'atenu, that there were Einu Mitzuvim V'Isam on Arayis, and the parish of Shuva L'Chem Eloichem was a specific matir. Zod Ramei Simcha, that matir wasn't just a Gzer Sakosu Ba'alma, Heter Mipi Elyoin L'Shoh. The basis of the heter is because there is a din of Kotten Shnei Ladomi, and Klal Yisrael b'Shas Matan Torah U'Geirim, Memele, it's shaykh the inyan of Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi Mikoyach Matan Torah. Memele Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem is not stam umzis Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem. The shirish of Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem is because Soif Kol Soif it had a Shem Geirus. So Memele, it could have in the Pneumius, it could have a mila of Kotten Shnei Ladomi. But if in that vada we could say like the Maral that there wasn't the emes a din of Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi. No, that Siboy Milamalo that countered the hasaga of Parshas Arayis mitoch the remozim of Taryag or the Alshech mitoch Sheresh Nishmasam, which has connected that a separate geder of exceptions which are called a tikkun lamalo, which was nichlal in Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem, zot the Meshech Chochmah. It wasn't stam umzis. It has a tzura. What's that tzura? That tzura is Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi, because Soif Kol Soif, since there is a mahalach of Geirus in Matan Torah and Ba'alma that has a din of Kotten Shnei Ladomi, memele shaykh that there should be an aspect of the heter of the dinim of Arai. So the Sikum Advarim, we have really in the Pshutim Shal Dvarim we have three mahalachim. In Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi b'negei to Parshas Arayis in Matan Torah. We have the Maral that the Maral asks, the way it's brought in the Shmaitz and Akdama, that all Arayis should have been mutter lo isna arboim shana. Zot the Maral kochach in Matan Torah there was no Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi b'chlal. Lefi the Maral, then we have to understand why Boichel Mishparesa was only later. The rebellion Mizrachi is mechadish. The whole parsha was only nitan later. The Maskil David says somehow that the notion that they were noisa then were mutter, and only notion that were noisa later became aser. We're suggesting that that's because mitchila it was only al yidei the yediyas advarim, but they weren't mitzuvim, and therefore zot the Meshech Chochmah they had the exception of Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem. Meshech Chochmah himself says that avada in Matan Torah there was a din of Gershon is Garke Kotten Shnei Ladomi, and that was the basis of the din of Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem. They can't? Correct, because we can't allow they couldn't. That heter of Shuva L'Chem L'Aleichem was only on the notion that there were not Correct. That was it. Right.